So we're here in Chicago today to talk a little bit about contemporary Marxism and contemporary political philosophy. And this is still relevant in 2018 because here's a communist newspaper that a friend of mine who has an apartment here in Chicago received by a passerby a couple of days ago here in town. In the Millennium Park, there's a giant mirrored bean behind me. And just over that giant mirrored bean is the art museum where Ferris Bueller went on his famous day off. He was my hero when I was in high school. So, Marxism, what's it all about? So there's two main things we want to talk about when it comes to contemporary Marxist political philosophy. Number one is alienation, and number two is exploitation. And let's talk about them in reverse order. So first of all, exploitation. What does it mean to exploit someone? Well, when you exploit a person, you take unfair advantage of them. And from the Marxist perspective, a capitalist, or just the person who has a lot of money, who owns things, and who invests, and who doesn't actually work or participate in the creative process of actually making goods, they take unfair advantage of the working class, or what Marx would call the proletariat, whenever they skim profits off the top of the productive process. So you've got the laborers, and you have the raw materials, and you have the machinery or the means of production that create the goods, whether it's shoes or stereos or televisions or computers. And then they sell these products, and you have all of those various inputs into the process, and then you have a little bit of money left over, which is profit, and the capitalist takes it for him or herself. Well, Marx argued that this was a form of theft. This was a disrespect of the workers' effort that they put into these materials and into these products. And since the capitalists didn't directly work to create anything, they just simply invested the money, they did not deserve it. A criticism of this conception of exploitation is that it seems to rely on a quasi-libertarian conception of property rights. So if it's the case that you think that the worker deserved 100% of the fruits of their labors, that seems to be very consistent with the libertarian argument that taxation is typically theft because workers deserve 100% of the fruit of their labors. Marxists and libertarians do not get along. Very different assumptions, very different conclusions, and when you begin with a premise like that, it's going to be very difficult to support the Marxist tenet of to each according to their needs. So you get the basic slogan, from each according to his ability and to each according to his needs. If you're going to argue that when you skim some off the top and give it to the capitalist, this is exploitation, unfair, a form of theft, it's going to be difficult to justify taxation to support the mentally infirm or the severely medically handicapped, etc. And these are the sorts of things that Marxists typically would want to be able to do. The other big part of contemporary Marxist theory or political philosophy is alienation. The argument here is that the capitalist process, the capitalist system encourages us all to be much more greedy, to treat one another as if we're simply means to an end rather than ends in our own sake, and to be much more materialistic as well. When a worker creates, or a craftsman creates, a pair of shoes in a communist society, they do so thinking of the person who will wear them in mind. They want those shoes to be comfortable, they want to give the person a lot of enjoyment in those shoes, and they build that love and that care into the creation of the shoes, and it's done from a perspective of love and not greed and self-interest. When a worker is a mere cog in the assembly line machine that produces shoes, they're not worried about or concerned with or thinking about the person who's actually going to wear those shoes at all, argues the communist. Instead, they're interested in the money they're going to receive from contributing their time and selling their labor in the wage labor or the wage slavery system, as some would call it. A criticism of this critique of capitalism, that it's alienating, is that sometimes people prefer alienating work if it means they'll get paid more, and perhaps they would have additional purchasing power to do things in their spare time that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. For example, I worked on an assembly line in East Tennessee at National Seating, and on this assembly line I would take two triangular metal parts and put them on what's called a spot welder. And I would take the two triangular parts, put them on the spot welder, and push a button and zap, it would weld them together. I would take a new piece and throw it in a pile. I would take two more of these triangular parts and put it on the spot welder and push the button, and it would zap them, weld them together, I'd throw it in the pile. I'd take two more of these triangular pieces, you get the picture. So I would do that for 8 hours a day, all day. Adam Smith, one of the classic proponents of capitalism and its many benefits, confessed that to the extent that labor is divided, it stupefies, which means whenever you divide these tasks up into these subtasks, unskilled workers can certainly do them, but whenever that's your entire job and that's what you do for 40 hours a week, it's not very creative, it's not very fitting for a human being to do or to spend their life doing. And so the Marxists critique that the productive process is alienating in many different ways may very well be the case. However, I worked at National Seating when I did because it paid more than would have the animal shelter, for example, or volunteering at the hospital, or working in landscaping. And so I made the conscious decision to work there and make more money and engage in very alienating work and mind-numbing work so I'd have more money to spend in my free time. Marxists would probably argue that we should design the workplace in ways that no job would be fully alienating. We can make them all somewhat autonomous and creative and such. But that's just the typical capitalist response, that perhaps people prefer this. And so there you go. There's some contemporary Marxist theory. You've got the exploitation argument, that the capitalist skims off of the top, and this is a form of theft. However, the critique of that argument or that criticism is that it relies on, or appears to rely on, libertarian-esque conceptions of self-ownership. And then you also have the alienation argument that the capitalist system makes us much more consumerist and selfish and such. Perhaps that is the case, and people may prefer to do that, and so it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that even if Marxists are correct about the deleterious symptoms of capitalism, they may not have the best solution. And their solution, which I should have emphasized in the beginning, is democratic control and ownership of the means of production. That's what Marxism is all about. That's why the exploitation argument and the alienation argument, or that's what they attempt to support, is taking away the factories and taking away the raw materials and such that are currently in private hands and putting all of that into public hands. But again, I think we have reason to think that even if Marxists are correct about, or somewhat correct about exploitation and alienation, even if they are, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to take the means of production and put them in the hands of society at large. But you be the judge as always. Thanks so much from windy Chicago.